Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to number 8, review of big game animal status for wolves. State Director Bob Williams, Nevada Office of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Informational, is right here.
Hi, for the record, I am Bob Williams, the State Director for Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nevada Fish and Wildlife Office. And Chairman Rain and Commission, thank you for inviting me. The status of wolves in the state of Nevada really has not changed. I don't know really what you want to talk about. I am here to answer questions. It's my understanding that the Commission, because I did talk with Commissioner Lent a couple of weeks ago, you're considering changing the status in the, here in Nevada from a game species to a non-classified species. And I think, for the record, that's a mistake. I think that it might give a wrong impression to the public in terms of what they can and can't do relative to taking of wolves in the state of Nevada, because they are federally protected. They are still endangered listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So they are federally protected. What's happened in the courts recently in August has not changed in any way the status and what law enforcement, federal law enforcement, would do with respect to somebody killing a wolf, taking a wolf for whatever reason, basically, unless it's, you know, protecting life and limb kind of a thing. So I'm here to answer questions, talk about, you know, what you're proposing.
Okay, I've got a question for you, and then we'll see if any commissioners have a question for you. First, basically, how does the state, the listing for the state on how the wolf is listed, whether it's big game, fur bearer, unprotected, how does that affect, what effect did that have on federal rules? How do they interact? How does the state rules and the federal rules interact with the wolves? Will it have any bearing on that, on the federal?
Not really, no. Other than I think that the interaction between state and federal law is that, for me, for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our law enforcement people, they basically will rule. You know, what you do state-wise, I think, put something out there. If you non-classify, you take it out of management by the Department of Wildlife with us, you know, you put it out there as an unprotected species like coyotes or whatever, unclassified, excuse me, then I think it's the wrong message you're sending to the public. You're sending a message that they could indiscriminately kill a wolf in the state of Nevada, and it's okay in the state of Nevada. That's not the case. They are still federally listed. Until, you know, the law changes, until the classification of the law of the species changes in Nevada, which I think we are still working on trying to do. You know, the law, the species itself has not changed over time. So since, you know, 1974, when they were federally protected within, you know, within the entire United States, 48 lower states.
Okay, let's go down here with Mr. Howell. Questions, and just remember, this is just kind of questions. The Commission will have another item here later on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding that the feds actually did delist the wolves, specifically Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And that Judge Moley, I think his name was, he overturned that.
That's correct.
And the wording that I read specifically mentioned the Rocky Mountains. We don't have any in Nevada. And I guess my question is, Nevada has the right to manage their game. And if we actually change the listing in Nevada from game mammal to unprotected species, I don't know why the feds would have any concern about that at all, because they've already delisted the wolf. It's the judge that overturned it, and the language that I read specifically mentioned the Rocky Mountains.
So you have to understand, I think, a little bit more, you know, the history of the listing of the wolf and what we have done over time. What happened in the early 2000s is when we set aside the Rocky Mountain distinct population segment, which did not include Nevada, we basically, were able to work with Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming on a plan for delisting of just that distinct population segment. It did not include the states of California. It did not include Nevada. It did not include Utah. So the rest of the listing of the animal, okay, still was in place. The delisting has been overruled. Our position right now is we have not decided to go and challenge that. The Department of Justice has that under review. What the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing, though, because of that, because we've tried, I think, 2 different times to delist that distinct population segment, we are looking again at the best way to protect and to delist the remaining, the species in its range. I think that the look right now that the Fish and Wildlife is doing could be the way that we fix the Nevada-California problem, because Nevada, I agree, did not have large populations of wolves historically. I think we've come here to the commission several times and made that statement. If we could fix what we did in 1974 by listing all wolves in the lower 48, we would like to fix that and basically have wolves protected where wolves need to be or should be managed better, if not better, but managed by the states that really have historical population of wolves. And that is, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, northern Utah, eastern Oregon, perhaps. So we are in the process of trying to fix this. And I think in time we might be able to be successful in fixing the problem here in Nevada.
Okay, we had Mr. Capurro, and then we'll go back. We'll go down, everybody, and then we'll come back.
With respect to the issue of wolves, has the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually had any documented sightings of wolves in the state of Nevada since about 1990?
I don't know of any that we have.
So right now, we don't have any wolves.
I can't say that either. I don't think that,
Well, officially, we don't have any wolves.
Well, we don't have any documented records, that's correct. I think there have been some possible sightings, but
those are undocumented and unresponsive. But the fact of the matter is, if we were to change the regulations regarding how wolves are treated, since there aren't any wolves to be subject to those regulations, it's kind of looking ahead maybe, then I don't see where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comes in.
Well, I mean, I'm not here to tell you you can't do something. I'm just, telling you what the rule is right now, if you will, and they are protected in the state of Nevada by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, under the Endangered Species Act. And if somebody was to shoot a wolf in the state of Nevada, they would be prosecuted, And that's what I'm telling you. And you can do, the state can do what the state wants to do. I think the better option is for us to continue to work with Department of Wildlife. And if we did start to see wolves, because we're having this happen in eastern Oregon, start working on a management plan. We can work with the state, through the Section 6 program to come up with some type of a state management plan for the species.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. Okay. The fact of the matter is that, and my point was this, that if Nevada's regulation doesn't protect it as you say the federal law does, then the only ones that could prosecute someone who shot a wolf would be federal authority. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And as long as Nevada had something like we have on the books now, they could also be prosecuted by Nevada authorities. Isn't that correct? So the whole point is, if you passed a regulation that it would at least exempt Nevada residents from that, then the only people they have to worry about are the federal authorities. Isn't that correct?
Okay, this is Brian Stockton. Sorry to interrupt, but with the caveat that I don't do criminal law, and I never have, and I hope I never will, Nevada, like a district attorney in Nevada could prosecute for a federal crime. That's just, they prosecute all laws. So if you violate a federal statute with no like in California, the marijuana laws. If you violate the federal marijuana laws, the prosecutors there could enforce the federal law. So no, that's not correct what you said.
I guess the point being, Mr. Stockton, that even if that's true, the possibility that a Humboldt district attorney would file suit against a Nevada resident for taking a wolf, mistakenly taking a wolf, I think are pretty low.
Okay, Mr. Vogler. Oh, we'll come back.
I'm not,
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, this is like a philosophy class. I mean, aren't you just saying, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? You just said that we don't have any wolves documented in the state, but you're more comfortable with it being classed as a big game animal than as a non-existent predator? What is the difference? If it doesn't exist here, you know, I assume that what we would choose to do with it.
I guess it's, to me, the messaging to the public. You know, when we work with the Department of Wildlife on, you know, management plans, and because we have lots of listed species in the state of Nevada, the public knows, you know, what they can do for catching lahont and cutthroat trout that's managed, that's federally listed as threatened, you know. So you're telling the public, not just your hunting public, you're telling the public, ranchers, farmers, that that's still a protected species. There's still rules about what can and can't be done with a wolf that enters the state of Nevada. Again, you know, we've had this problem, you know, since 1974 when we listed this. We've been in front of the commission several times trying to, you know, continue to say we have this problem, we're going to work on it or whatever, but it really isn't a problem other than the messaging, I think, to the public. You know, if you declassify it and you say it's no better than a coyote or whatever else, because that's not true. If it comes in, there is laws that protect it. So,
What then, as a follow-up?
Okay.
All right. You have a classification as a predator or as a game species. We don't have, if we don't have any, we don't have either one. So the hunting public has seen the devastation of the herds of elk and everything in the wildlife all through the Rocky Mountains, and they're up in arms about that. This commission is supposed to help those folks. As the rancher representative, if a wolf was decimating a herd of sheep or some calves for me or any other of the people that raise livestock in this state, what about the Fifth Amendment of being able to protect your property?
well, that's where I think if you left it as a classified, you know, species, we could work on a management plan. And that basically then, you know.
And therein lies my problem. Predator or big game species, if we don't have it, I mean, we're wafting philosophically, supposedly, about something that doesn't exist. Should we also have, should we classify the unicorn as a big game species or as a wild horse? Now, isn't that the same thing? I'm not trying to be facetious with you, sir, but that's exactly what it sounds like to me. We're talking about something that supposedly doesn't exist, so how, you know, well, big deal.
No, and I didn't mean to infer that supposedly it didn't exist. There have been possible sightings. There could be wolves in the garbage area, you know, so I'm just telling you what the law is right now and giving advice, if you will.
Okay, Mr. Lent, we have a question for Mr. Williams.
No, I just wanted to make some comments on this wolf issue. We discussed this in WAFA in Anchorage quite a bit, and this is a states' rights issue, and you know, we are required to protect the wildlife, manage the wildlife in this state, and we can do a better job without the feds managing and protecting our wildlife. The Fish and Wildlife Service, and I had a big discussion for hours with, and I talked to Bob Williams on this with Dan Ash. He's a deputy director in Washington, D.C. of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're suing Wyoming Fish and Game because they put it as a game animal and it's too tight, and so no matter what kind of plan we have, they're going to sue us, and we're letting a small group of people, the pro-wolf people, dictate our lives and destroying our wildlife. We don't manage wolves, wolves manage us. It's a disaster in Idaho, it's a disaster in Montana, and it's a disaster in Wyoming. And right now, Montana legislator has got a bill in Washington, D.C., prohibition on treatment of Rocky Mountain gray wolves in Idaho and Montana as endangered species. They're going to the extent to do a bill in D.C. There's a resolution in Idaho Fish and Game Commission against wolf management, 3 pages. They're opposed to what the feds are doing. The governor of Idaho made a proclamation. He wants the federal government to draw up a new agreement giving the state a role in wolf management. The Fish and Wildlife Service will not do it. And I'm going to read you Amendment 10 of the Constitution, okay? It says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This says the people of Nevada have a right to manage the wildlife in this state. And what happens is we're not in the DPS, and therefore we have a right to declare the animal anything we want, which is a varmint. And the secret is never let them in the state because they're an ungulate eating machine. And you know, the 10J rule applies south of I-90, which says experimental populations south of I-90 exterminate the problem animals. And we got the 4D rule that allows recreational harvest on experimental populations. So we do have some recourse that we can do it. And we're going to take this up as an agenda item next. I know we are.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to, we can do a better job managing our wildlife and protecting our wildlife without the feds coming in and telling us what to do. And the feds don't set our season and dates other than migratory birds, but deer and other big animals migrate also. And it's a state's rights, and the federal government should be less involved in our right and let this Wildlife Commission regulate wolves, because if you have elk in this state, you're going to have wolves sooner or later. And if you look what they're doing in Montana and Wyoming, they're destroying it, and the feds are suing the states to stop them from killing the wolves. And that's exactly what's happening. And with this Judge Malloy making this decision, it's really messed up everything. So now they're going back to the wheel and going back to the federal government to try to make a law to allow the states of managing their own resources. And that's why making them a game animal, I think, is wrong, but we'll discuss that.
Yeah, can we try to keep this aimed towards questions right now, and then we'll get into general discussion. Go ahead, Mr. McBeth.
Okay, I'll frame it as a question. It's Williams. Mr. Williams?
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct.
Basically, you do agree that as a general proposition, wildlife comes under the jurisdiction of the state.
Absolutely, unless it becomes federally listed. Yes.
Unless a federal statute comes into play. For instance, federal statute on wild horses. Once the federal government decides to act, especially on federal land, then that's the end of it. Jurisdiction is removed from the state, and if anybody wants to test it, go shoot a horse and tell me how it goes for you. Yeah. And with respect to wolves, isn't the federal statute at issue the Endangered Species Act?
Correct.
So the federal government has decided to act. They have acted with regard to wolves, and therefore the jurisdiction of the state has been removed.
That's correct.
And in my opinion, the idea of classifying a wolf as an unprotected animal is going to be very confusing, because we will then have people that will look to that statute and say, if it's unprotected, then it's just like a coyote, I can shoot it. And that would be a terrible mistake, because they will then feel the brunt of the federal government in prosecution of them with respect to that action. And would you agree that would be the case?
That's correct. And I have to say that, you know, once the jurisdiction, you know, of a species under the Endangered Species Act rolls to the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have a history of working cooperatively with the Department of Wildlife. And that's where I, firmly believe that leaving it as a classified species, we could continue to work with the state on developing some type of a plan for whatever wolves might come, into the state of Nevada, as rare as it might be. Where Idaho and Montana and Wyoming have been is trying to establish a certain population of wolves to be managed by the state with the authority or with the cooperation of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so the species can be delisted, but we still have the animal in those states, So I thank you for your
and I guess what I want to conclude is that really it does come down to the perception that the public and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the other federal agencies has towards the state of Nevada and this commission and the Department of Wildlife with respect to the subject of wolves. And so we can take this action to make them an unprotected animal, and all it's going to do is cast the commission and the department in a bad light. That's my opinion.
Okay. Let's see. Any of the commissioners haven't said anything yet? Well, anything, and then we'll go back to the ones that have. Mr. Cavan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the frustration that we see is that we've seen what's happened with the wild horse, and that happened in 1972. You're asking for cooperation for a problem that came about in 1974. And it seems like, to me, the Fish and Wildlife Service at some point should have said, okay, Nevada, you are not part of this, and we are going to give you something that tells you you are off the hook as far as wolves go. And that, to me, should be what the feds are doing. I mean, we've seen this thing explode into an unbelievable problem. No one ever anticipated where we're at this point. So when you ask me to cooperate for another X number of years after we have, I guess maybe we weren't on alert for the last 36 years, I guess. But we're on alert now. And so that's where our frustrations is, right or wrong, or no matter what side of the fence you're on. So when I came on this commission just over 2 years ago, the very first thing, Commissioner Macbeth was there, same situation. Dr. Lent was there, same situation. Grant was there, same situation. Very first thing we were asked to do was make the wolf a game animal. And during that discussion, we asked what would happen to someone who took a wolf accidentally, how this would be treated. Interestingly enough, as I recall, nothing was brought up about being prosecuted on a federal level. Chief Bonamici said, I think we were talking about possibly a $500 fine. It didn't even come into the discussion. Why that is, I don't know. But I'm almost positive it was my first meeting in Eureka. And I specifically asked the question, I was uncomfortable making it a game animal. I specifically asked the question, what are we doing here? How difficult is this to change, to modify, whatever? And I think Chief Bonamici answered the question, we can change it. And so we passed that, I'm pretty sure unanimously, and now just in the past 2 years, what we've seen happen with the wolf, has the hair up on the back of everybody's neck here. So changing it back to where we were before, that should not be that big of a deal, but obviously we've got some issues, and I don't know where we want to go with this thing, but I think the feds have, you know, to you guys, 36 years isn't an issue. But to us, we've built up these elk herds, particularly in the northeast corner of the state. We've built these elk herds up over a period of time. I had the same conversation a year ago at Waffle with one of the biologists, and I said, you know, what do you think is going to happen in Nevada with the wolf? Are they coming? And he said, do you have elk? And I said, yeah, we have elk. He said, it's inevitable. And I think the feds, if we didn't have wolves, we never had wolves, it's never been part of the plan to have wolves, feds should be doing something about that. Thank you.
And if I could comment, I guess, and I think in an earlier comment, I did say that we are reviewing that. I think the action of the commission right now in the state, given what happened in August, and we're going back to the drawing board, would be a strong admonition to the Fish and Wildlife Service to take an action to, you know, reclassify and delist, if you will, or you wouldn't say delist, but just reclassify the listing of the species to only the northern Rocky Mountain states. Because those state management plans were ready to go. We were ready to delist, all except for the state of Wyoming. They didn't step to the plate enough to really achieve the, you know, delisting. So, you know, right now would be a good time for the commission, for the state to ask the Fish and Wildlife in the review of the status of the wolf to no longer protect it in these lower states where historically they never, or the populations were really low historically.
All right.
That could be something that the service would act on right now as we're trying to evaluate what to do next given this, you know, court decision.
All right, Danny, either of the commissioners haven't spoken yet, have anything? And then we'll go back. Okay, and we'll go right down the row of each person redress. Mr. Vogler?
I still don't understand the fine line. If we've got it listed as a game species now, we can't even hunt them, we can't even set up a season. So what is it to anybody that, whether it's, why would there be no cooperation if we took a stand and said, as far as we're concerned, it's a varmint? Most of the Native American people in this state never even had a word for wolf. So we're kind of, again, wafting philosophically. Why would it be any different for you to work with this department, whether it was classified as a myth?
Well, I think that, you know, I understand your frustration and the concern, and I still believe that you leave it classified as game, it still gives, you know, the Department of Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife greater opportunities to do something, to put something in place.
But you wouldn't cooperate if we listed it as a varmint?
Well, of course we'll continue to cooperate, but it'd be a much different message that you're sending to the public. That it's no longer trying to be, you know, managed, or, you know, we're no longer working together on what we can do to, you know, inform the public, work with the public on the status of the species in Nevada, and looking to Idaho or Eastern Oregon where we think wolves might be coming, you know, in terms of management. So.
And the other thing, for a point of clarification, Mr. Macbeth, on the wild horses, the state of Wyoming sued and prevailed against the federal government for not managing the wild horses as per the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And for about 3 years, much to Nevada's chagrin, it has the largest populations of wild horses. All the money went to Wyoming to get them in compliance. So I'm not so sure that we don't have standing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the federal government to protect the game species in the state of Nevada. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, and I think, Bob, I think that the feds are being disingenuous, and I want this for all the sportsmen out here, when he's talking about Idaho. And, you know, Idaho agreed to take 25 mating pairs. And then they said that wasn't enough. And then they went to 50. And then the antis came in and said, oh no, we need at least 200 mating pairs. And believe me, after you get over 20, it's destroying the elk population. So they put a season on them, and they killed 382. You'll never manage wolves by hunters. It's impossible. And so they agreed with the feds to put X number, a low number of mating pairs, and then the feds kept upping it, and upping it. And so now we got 200 mating pairs, and that was sort of the upper limit, and that's not enough. And it's destroying all the wildlife in Idaho. And, you know, I can give you all sorts of documentation of that. So, you know, I think the feds are not telling us the truth, because Idaho agreed to take a few pair in there on this experimental base because they're in the DPS there. And you open the door and let them in, and there's no turning back. The feds will say, no, we changed our mind. We want you to take more breeding pairs, and it's really bad to do that. And that's why I say we can always, if we go to non-game and they want to negotiate with us, we can always put them back in the game. Like Commissioner Cabin said, that was the agreement. It's not that hard to do with Russ Mason. When we put them into a game animal, we can always put them back there. But right now, I think we have a problem the way it's right now. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, the comparison between horses and wolves is kind of disingenuous because, number one, we acknowledge there are feral or wild horses, as you will, in Nevada, and they're subject to the Wild Horse and Burro Act. My point was we have no wolves in Nevada officially. So here's the catch-22 that we have. I'm a rancher in Easton. I'd like your interpretation of this. I'm a rancher in eastern Nevada, and I go out in the fields and I find that I find in process an animal that looks sort of like a coyote but bigger that has killed one of my prize cows. And that if it were a coyote, I could shoot it with no possible chance of being prosecuted for it. Conversely, if it turns out I shoot it and it turns out to be a wolf, I can be prosecuted, and that's exactly what you're saying. The point is this, that in those Rocky Mountain states that are subject to that wolf reintroduction program, they do have the rule, I think it's called the 4D rule, that basically says that if a farmer or rancher is experiencing extirpation of his cattle, his sheep, whatever, that he can, in effect, kill problem wolves. We have no such protection in Nevada because we don't have a wolf plan. But if we adopt a wolf plan, we are acknowledging that we will have or we want wolves in the state of Nevada. So that's a catch-22 for us. We don't want wolves in the state of Nevada. Understand that. I don't think a person in here wants wolves in the state of Nevada. Yet we have no protection for those situations where there might be a mistake made, where my property, my cattle, my sheep might be being killed by these animals. And if it's a coyote, I can kill it, but it's a wolf, I can't. And we don't have the protections of the 4D rule or in the other Rocky Mountain states that are subject to that rule. And so therefore we're out here trying to figure out how to protect both the sportsmen of the state of Nevada, the farmers and ranchers of the state of Nevada, who we also have a responsibility to, and to the department, who has to try to figure out how to administer this, and a commission that has to answer to the sportsmen. So the question then becomes, at some point in time, we have to say to the feds, you need to delist Nevada from this process. And, you know, otherwise, I don't see any good reason why we shouldn't proceed with unprotecting wolves in the state of Nevada. Thank you.
Any?
I just would say that goes to what I recommend or recommended the commission really do, and that is to petition the service right now in this reclassification that we're about to embark on, to remove Nevada from any classification of wolves down here, then you would be able to totally manage them the way you want if they do come down from Idaho or Oregon. And you said it very well. The problem was the original listing, endangered in the lower 48. The DPS gave, the opportunity for Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, the 4D rule, after they 10J experimentally, brought them in there, and they were very successful. But the states were then given the opportunity to manage them under their state management plans because they were downlisted to threatened. The problem that we have here is they are still listed as endangered. They're not threatened. If they had been listed as threatened down here, we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't be talking about it. We would have a plan. So right now is the time to petition the service in this relooking of the status of the species and the classification to remove Nevada from, further consideration. We are not even thinking about Nevada as an area for recovery or potential,
All right, Mr. Trum, Mr. Howell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Been a lot of conversation. I'd just like to say, when you get to number 9, I'm ready to make a motion.
We gotta get to number 9. We're not number 9, we're number 8. Do we have any other questions from the commission? We'll have public comment here on number 9. It's just informational here. Same, anybody wants, they can. Okay. So, okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Now we move on to number 9, and the commission may discuss, create, or give instructions to staff to draft regulatory changes to include status method take of wolves. First thing we'll have is public comment. What do we have for numbers, Mr. Vice Chairman? Oh, excuse me. Before we do that, we're going to have a brief break, and then we'll come right back to public comment first thing.